Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Be sure to check out our new podcast, The Geopolitical Update, with CDA Deputy Director and former Director of Policy to Canada's Minister of National Defense, Joe Varner. Every Friday, Joe will provide in-depth analysis of the most significant geopolitical events of the week. Be sure to catch us this Friday morning. This is the Expert Series. Nearly one quarter of the U.S. Senate criticized Prime Minister Trudeau over Canada's defense spending, urging him to present a plan at the NATO Summit to meet the alliance's spending target. Ambassador David Cohen also recently noted that Canada is becoming an outlier in NATO as it falls short of the 2% GDP defense spending target. These remarks are particularly salient given that the NATO Summit in Washington is fast approaching, and in light of Canada's recently released defense policy update, which pledged billions of dollars in spending over the next several years. We'll use this backdrop to discuss Canada's defense policy update, with perspectives from the United States on the update and the new spending announcements outlined in the document, the significance of that recent letter, what we can expect at the upcoming NATO summit, and to what extent the DPU provides a roadmap for procurement reform and renewing our submarine fleet. Joining me today to discuss these topics are Philippe Lagacé, Stephen Sederman, and Christopher Sands. To discuss what's in the DPU, procurement for reform, and submarines, we'll first turn to Philippe Lagacé, Associate Professor and Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Philippe, good to see you, and thanks for joining us again. So what would you say are the general takeaways from the defense policy update? What did you like? What didn't you like? And what still needs to be done?
I see the defense policy update as addressing a few holes that were left in place by Strong Secure Engaged. So I see it as almost an intermediary policy where addressing certain things that needed to be dealt with that hadn't been effectively dealt with in the 2017 policy. So when we look at something like infrastructure or extending the life of the frigates, given the time it's taking to get the service combatants built, these are just basic considerations that had to be put in place. Similarly, there's a number of other capabilities that were lingering or hadn't been properly funded in SSE that are moving forward. But as a number of people pointed out, the defense policy update was more cautious when it comes to other big ticket items that ultimately have to move forward at some point. The biggest one, obviously, is submarines. And I'm hoping that within the next little while, ideally before an election, the government will provide clear funding and policy cover for the submarine project to move forward.
What did the DPU say about submarine replacements, and what factors should Canada consider when evaluating the suitability of submarines for its maritime defense strategy?
So the defense policy update was clear that it is exploring options when it comes to submarines. Now, what exactly that means is a bit vague. I think it's fair to say that despite the Prime Minister musing that a nuclear option would be examined, I don't think that's in the offing. The reality is if Cabinet was hesitant about the price of a diesel-electric submarine, then it will certainly not be in favor of moving ahead with a far more expensive nuclear option. So we're looking at a diesel-electric, ideally with a capability through air-independent propulsion to operate under ice for a certain amount of time. As well, the range in a Canadian context is key. So certain diesel-electric submarines are more local or designed for the European theater where the distances may not be as great. So you need a submarine that has the range that is required for what Canada would use it for, both to the Arctic, the Pacific, and deployments in other parts of the world. Equally important, I think, will be considerations around which other allies are using the boat, what kind of parts and sustainment and interchangeability is factoring into it. So there's likely to be a great deal of hesitancy on the part of Canada to be the sole owner of one variant or one type of submarine, given the risks involved in that. As well, if the government wants to move quickly on the submarine replacement and avoid some of the pitfalls that have surrounded the Canadian surface combatant, it will decide to acquire a submarine that is already in service. Now, as we saw with the Type 26, that was modified a little bit such that there was a design in place, but not necessarily a ship in service. Now, that leads to significant risk, as we've seen with that approach. So, would the government be advised in this case to move ahead with a submarine that is clearly already in service and not merely finish its design phase? I suspect we may see something like that. All that said, and sorry, I'm going on a little long here, but all that said, the risk is there may not be an existing in-service submarine right now that meets all our requirements. But if we want to move quickly on this, I would argue that we need to take a slightly different approach and not go to manufacturers with our requirements, but ask manufacturers to tell us what their boats can do, and then we select amongst those that are already existing.
Does the defense policy update get us closer to 2%? Does that matter? And how are our allies feeling about where we are in terms of spending?
So the defense policy update doesn't get us to 2% yet. It gets us to 1.76 later in this decade, and then it will begin to fall back down afterwards. At least that's what the projection is. But I don't think we're fully cognizant of what we're looking at in terms of overall defense spending in the decades to come. The sustainment, modernization, upgrade costs for certain fleets are going to be significant, notably the F-35 and the surface combatants. So we may end up with a defense budget that has to go above 2% to maintain the force that we're currently building. Similarly, if that submarine project does come on the line, then it will, in all likelihood, push us above 2% for a certain amount of time. But the real issue in a Canadian context, and I suspect this is going to be true for NATO in general, is it's not about meeting the 2% threshold for a year or two. It's about sustaining it at that level. And I'm not fully confident that either the government or even the Defense Department is clear about what that would entail and what that would look like.
Can you explain what needs to be reformed when it comes to procurement, how it can be done, and what realistically could be achieved in maybe the near to medium term?
So overall, I think the main defense procurement reform that we should be aiming for is reducing simply the amount of process that's involved, and that would come along with a streamlining of some of the oversight as well. Greater delegation down to at the departmental level for certain types of acquisitions as well, and a different approach that would try and treat certain rapidly evolving technology through a different stream or a different type of process so that defense can stay at the cutting edge of technology. Right now, the systems that we have in place for major capital projects don't allow for a nimble approach that ensures that when you're acquiring the equipment, you're acquiring it at the leading edge, and similarly that you're able to make rapid acquisitions of things like updates and modernizations that are necessary to keep the capabilities that we have at the forefront of operational effectiveness.
How does the government's update to the defense policy aim to address the long-standing issue of slow and ineffective defense procurements in Canada?
Arno Strong and Free made clear that there is a reform review underway for defense procurement, and that's being led by an ADM within PSPC. So that process is underway. It's been going on for some time, but even that ADM herself has said that this is really a cultural issue more than anything else. You need to tackle the government's aversion to risk when it comes to procurement. And the overall risk aversion that we have in the government of Canada and the hesitancy that we have to make decisions. So I would hope, as we're looking at various mechanisms, are there things that we can do to accelerate decision making, allowing certain decision makers to make choices more quickly, and in some cases, create new paths for more accelerated procurements. As we're seeing urgent operational requirements and national security exemptions remove certain barriers, but they don't really remove the ones that are the most critical to accelerating procurement per se. So there needs to be new processes in place to speed things up. And to do so, though, you do need to have really a cultural change within the entirety of the government of Canada when it comes to the acceptance and management of risk.
Just to press you on that a little further, what do you think are some of the sources of this risk averseness?
Well, as we saw with ArriveCAN, the reality is that As soon as a procurement goes off the rails, it creates quite a bit of controversy and scandal. And understandably, questions are asked about how money was spent, whether proper oversight was exercised, whether proper procedures were followed, and so forth. And so the immediate reaction to within government to that kind of problem and that kind of controversy is to layer on more procedures, more oversight, more rules in order to try and contain this. The difficulty is that, as some commentators have pointed out, um, a scandal like ArriveCAN happens because you have so many procedures, so many rules in place that you end up creating firms whose sole expertise is navigating that process. As much as it sounds like you're controlling risk by adding more oversight, adding more layers, in reality, you may even be increasing it in some cases. But to get to the number of your question, the issue is simply that the expectation on the part of the public and most politicians when a scandal or a problem occurs is to add more oversight, more safeguard, more process, more procedures, slower decision making. Unfortunately, if we keep approaching it that way in defense, we're never going to be able to keep pace with technological change and the adversary.
Philippe, thanks for your time. Always good to have you on. Up next, Stephen Seidemann, Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University's Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, Director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network, and host of the Battle Rhythm podcast. Steve, thanks for joining me again. Good to see you again. So DPU, what are your main takeaways from the DPU? What did you like? What didn't you like? And how should this document be interpreted?
I think the DPU is way overdue. I think we should do these things every 4 years. It was nice to see in the document the idea that they would actually do these things every 4 years. They're trying to change, do more like pretty much almost every other democracy that we compare ourselves to. So that will give us a good benchmark, a way to measure progress, and also to have quicker turnarounds. That is, rather than waiting 7 years to reevaluate, oh wow, Russia's invaded someplace, move a little faster. So I thought that was really important. I thought the discussion of having probation for incoming people, it was important because that's a speed people in and then kick them out if they don't meet the standards, whether that's because they are far right or because they're not physically fit or because their serial clearance crashes. I think that was a really important thing. So I think a couple of policy things in there that were important. I think $8 million the next 5 years is probably too small because I think the needs are very large. And I think $74 billion or so over 20 years sounds like a lot, but I don't think is that as much as it should be. We are in a severe personnel crisis. That should have been really priority number one. And if you take a look at the spending of the $8 billion over 5 years, it's not really front loaded to deal with personnel issues. There's money in there for housing, there's money in there for daycare, which is important, but it's not as much, and it tends to be backloaded in those 5 years. That should be money should be pouring out of the spigot right now, because the personnel crisis can just is a spiral. That is, you can have people who are dissatisfied because they're doing 2 or 3 jobs because there's nobody filling those jobs, or there are services that people aren't getting within the military because there's empty positions. So either way, they need to fix that. And by the way, to get to 2%, it'd be nice to be able to pay the 16,000 missing people. That's an important way to get to, to spend more money in the military, is to actually have bodies that you feed, you house, you pay, you do all that sort of stuff with. If we're not spending money on those people, then I don't see how we can get to 2%.
It doesn't look like we'll be getting to 2% quite yet, rather around 1.76%. What are your thoughts on this?
Obviously, I'm a 2% skeptic because I think any measure that's an input measure rather than output measure is problematic, so that you can spend a lot of money. Like the example I'm using these days is that the United States spends a lot of money on ships that they decided, oh, wait, these LCS craft aren't really worthwhile. We're just going to put them away. We're not going to use them. Well, they spent a lot of money. It counts towards 2%, but does that really help the alliance? Or we can always use Greece. But given that everybody talks about 2%, I think moving towards it, which is what this does, is I think is satisfying to me. I'm not a ordinary U.S. senator. I don't know why the U.S. senators have this particular stick up their butt, because Canada is moving the right direction. I mean, Canada should be actually moving faster in this direction if it's worried about no longer having American logistics support in the world if Donald Trump becomes president. But of course, you can't tell the Republicans, hey, if you elect Trump, we'll certainly spend a lot more because we're gonna have to defend ourselves from you, or we'll have to do more defense stuff without the United States because it could be thoroughly unreliable. But I don't think that's the message they want to hear. Um, I think it's realistic that they say, okay, we can't get to 2% that quickly because we have to. One of the things that's in the defense policy update is money to hire people to do the buying. That you just can't go on Amazon and order a bunch of ships or planes or whatever. You need personnel to evaluate the bids, to craft the standards of the competition, to evaluate the bids, to issue the contract, to supervise the contracts. That all the procurement stuff is a lot of it's very complicated. It requires a lot of real live people. We call them bureaucrats. We tend to dismiss them, but we need people to do this stuff. And governments like to cut those people out because it's easy to say, "Hey, we got the bureaucracy," but you need people to do the stuff. So that's a problem for getting to 2% quickly. Again, the aforementioned personnel crisis. We can't spend money on people we don't have in the military. Um, so I think they were being honest. The example I'll use these days is Finland. I was in Finland a month or so ago, and they got to 2% quickly because they bought all their F-35s up front. And that's great. Okay, they now have a more modern Air Force soon, but then what? They're now scrambling to come up with a plan for figuring out how to spend 2% of their GDP on defense because they don't have a steady stream of expenses, so they have to figure it out.
Canadian defense spending is in the news again. The American ambassador to Canada said we're on the periphery, and this was followed by a letter signed by 23 senators to the PM urging for more defense spending. How would you interpret this feedback from our neighbors down south?
That's a really good question. I'm not really sure why American senators that hung up on this. This comes in the heels of Canada agreeing to buy the P-8. That is, we're buying an American-made plane. We're not insisting that it's made in Canada. Uh, it's a significant purchase. It's going to employ a bunch of Americans. So why are they complaining? If we get to 2%, is it just, we're buying the F-35, where that's, again, an American-made plane. They're going to profit off of it, more jobs for the Americans. That had some stuff in there about, there are some things where the Canadians are being employed, but it's not like the shipbuilding program where we're spending gobs and gobs of money on employing Canadians and not Americans, right? We're using a British design. We're having all kinds of other folks involved. I don't think they're demanding that we Canadians buy American ships. If they want us to spend 2% quickly, then they could cut us a deal on U.S. nuclear submarines. That will get us way beyond 2% quickly because those are super expensive. But is that what they're trying to do? They're trying to drum up business for the submarine programs. I haven't done the work to find out where these senators reside and what defense contractors are in their states. So that would be the first step, is to figure out what is their electoral interest, because Ted Cruz doesn't care about anything besides Ted Cruz. And so the fact that he signed on to this, he is not a serious foreign policy or defense critic of any kind. And so that he's on this, what is, maybe, the question is, what are the Democrats doing about this? Why are they so chuffed about this? I'm not sure.
The Washington Summit is approaching. Do you see these calls from senators and the ambassador influencing dynamics at the summit? And more generally, what do you think we can expect going into this year's summit?
I would say that they're probably to get a fair amount of criticism for they're not spending enough, that their plan is not as aggressive enough, but they can point to the Germans who've made promises that they're clearly not going to keep. They could point to other countries that are falling short. They can have conversations about what is it they're going to buy. We're in the middle of talking about the possibility of submarines down the road, so they can say this is a floor, not a ceiling. The other thing I would do is I look at the last couple of ministerials. That is, that every year the defense ministers of NATO countries get together and the foreign ministers of NATO countries get together, and they have meetings to prepare the way towards a summit, to develop policies, discussions, conversations, so they can have some deliverables to announce at the summit. I have lost track of what has been discussed in those last couple of things, and so maybe you can have one of your research assistants go back to the last few ministerials and say, what have they been discussing? What have they been announcing? But those should lead to a pathway towards what we see. But there'll be a whole bunch of things. They always list like 100 or 150 different items on the communique about all the things they agree to. And all those things are agreed to before the summit. The summit is like a conference for an academic. It forces you to make decisions. And so it will force them to come to consensus on all kinds of things. But the big thing last year was Sweden and Finland. I don't think anything's going to come close to that this time around.
Steve, thanks for joining the podcast. It's always fun chatting with you.
My pleasure, Josh. And your listeners can also join us on Battle Rhythm, which is the podcast of the CDSN, where we also talk about things like this. But it's always a pleasure to be on your podcast.
To close out this episode, we'll turn to Chris Sands, director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Chris, it's so good to have you back on. Good to see you again, and thanks for joining me today. So we've been noticing a flurry of news coming out of Canada. Firstly, Ambassador David Cohen mentioned that Canada seems to be standing out with the alliance. In a recent development, 23 U.S. senators addressed a letter to Trudeau expressing their apprehensions about Canada's military expenditures. So with these developments in mind, what are the prevailing attitudes within the U.S. regarding Canada's defense spending presently? And moreover, does this public scrutiny from Washington reflect broader concerns that the U.S. may harbor about NATO's capacity to tackle ongoing security challenges? I understand that's a pretty big question, but I'm eager to hear your insights.
Let me start with a sort of threat that people see here. And I think you would find Republicans and Democrats, uniformed military and national security planners and analysts all very much convinced that the world that we're entering in has a lot of asymmetric threats. And, the Cold War was stable because although we were outnumbered by the Soviets in terms of manpower and so forth, and they were a lot closer to the European theater, the great equalizer was nuclear weapons. And we provided a nuclear umbrella for our allies. We didn't encourage allies to add nuclear weapons of their own, just as a deterrent force. And that was the world we lived in. And so Canada developed a habit during that period of underfunding defense. Because after all, the great equalizer was the nuclear umbrella. Beyond that, it was really just figure out what the Americans could use on the margins and make a contribution to keep the skills and the capabilities up. But it didn't put a lot of pressure on Canada. What we've seen because of Ukraine and because of what we anticipate could be happening with Taiwan and even Israel, Gaza to some extent, is the rise of a lot of threats that are not deterred by nuclear weapons, to put it mildly. And it's led all of the allies to reassess their defense spending in terms of not necessarily big dollars, but capabilities, drones and counter drone activity, raw ammunition, having enough ammunition in stock, making sure that fighter aircraft are trained and in good working order, and that you had the people ready to go, because we may not have time for mobilization before a big fight. That has led to a different conversation within NATO, which is how can everyone make contributions in that regard? There's a very pointed part of that which goes to Canada, and that has to do with the shift in the Arctic, where NATO Arctic now faces Russia Arctic with the Chinese very much on the Russian side. It's a serious threat, and if you look across NATO Arctic, the big weak link really is Canada in terms of domain awareness, ability to respond. From that's come a real desire to see Canada spend in that area, and the Canada's defense policy update really focuses on the Arctic. I think that's very much in line with where people are in the United States. I think it's going to be very well received, especially if there's follow through. Because as you know, there have been a lot of defense policy updates or even Arctic plans that have sounded great and then never followed through. So I think there's that. Now, behind that, specific to Canada, I think there are two schools of thought here in the US. One is that Canada has to be persuaded to step up. This is what I call the Canada that won't. You haven't spent, but if we just put enough pressure on you or say the message in the right way, pretty please with sugar on top, whatever, you will come through and spend the money and address this problem if we persuade you and if there are enough carrots to go with the sticks, etc. The other school is the Canada that can't school. And this has become a very significant faction that look within the analytic community mainly that says, well, even if Canada wants to, it's not clear that it can. Now, that may be because of fiscal realities. It may be because they've recognized that the Canadian military has hit such a weak point that just doing basic maintenance would cost a lot of money, and an effective fighting force is possibly not on the table at all. This is the faction that looks at the Latvia deployment and wonders how sustainable is it for Canada. I know Canada wants to get to brigade strength by 2026, but is it even worth it? Should we instead invite the Swedes to take that on because they're ready today? And I think that's really a worrisome divide, because I'm not sure what the right answer is. Is it that Canada can't? I like to think you have the money, wealthy country. If you wanted to, you could. But the problem is that, for example, when Haiti was on our list and we asked Canada if you could help out with Haiti, for very good reasons, you said no. And we've certainly would like to get you more involved, but we also don't want to embarrass you. So why ask if we know we're going to get a no, unless we want to rub your noses in it, which doesn't really do us any good. When you look at things like Indo-Pacific, that dichotomy is very much in play. Canada wants to be in AUKUS. We didn't ask you. We didn't ask you because we didn't think you could sustain that with the level of commitment you already have. And why ask you and have you be embarrassed? It might be just as easy for us to kind of cover that. And that's been our response to Canada in the Indo-Pacific in general, whether it's the North Pacific or whatnot. When you show up, it's wonderful, but whether that's sustainable, et cetera, that's really the question. I stand with the 23 senators who wrote, feeling that, you know, Canada can do this. It just has to recognize that the world has changed, that these commitments are really necessary. They're not as unaffordable as maybe they were in a different era, and that it would really make a difference to Canada's role internationally and Canada's national security. But I know that there's the Canada can't faction out there, and we'll have to overcome that. The only way to overcome that is to show that you can, because you do, I guess.
Chris, we've been circling around the topic a bit, but I'm wondering more specifically about the general reaction in the United States to our recently announced defense policy update. Are sentiments leaning towards confidence in Canada's commitment, or is there skepticism? You know, actions speak louder than words. Is there optimism, or is there a cautious wait-and-see approach prevailing in assessing whether Canada will follow through on its announced initiatives?
Partly that. I mean, remember that the defense policy update came out at about the time that the budget indicated that Canada would get not to 2%, but 1.76% by 2030, something like that. The long horizon and that combination of messages shows that Canada knows what it needs to do, and could, at least has outlined what would it take to make the Arctic more defensible, but that Canada isn't even able to come up with a math that would get you to 2%. And I've heard some people in Ottawa say, "Don't worry, we could do 2% if we had to. We'll see how the U.S. election goes," that kind of thing. It shouldn't really be about that. It should be that we're facing really serious threats today, and everyone knows you can't build a fighting force, you know, in 6 months. It will take time. So the idea that even in your wildest dreams, it was impossible for this government to put a number out there that would get you to 2%. I mean, you could come up with a new math and say, okay, by 2050, we're going to get to 2% for sure. And it wouldn't really feel real. It's about making those concrete steps. What could Canada do? NORAD modernization, which was the centerpiece of the last budget, that was your big commitment, is on such a slow rise. Seeing that accelerate would make a big difference. Canada's taking delivery of some F-35s early on. That's good, you know, because you'll start getting some practice and so on. Maybe accelerating that purchase or making some other changes. Also recruitment. Canada's had some terrible trouble with recruitment, and that's something that the military has to address. It's not really about money, I don't think. It's much more about whether there's a commitment to maintaining that force. Certainly, Parliament has authorized more members of the Canadian forces than you currently have, and so that, I think, undermines the confidence that Americans would have that you are on your way to becoming that full-fledged defense ally that we would love to have. And I think one of the challenging things about where we are in Washington now is that everyone is talking about fairly plausible scenarios that could see us at war in the near term. Not something we want, but something we have to be prepared for. And right now, even with the defense policy update, the question is, does Canada have the urgency that it needs to get where it needs to go fast enough? And even if you're a Canada that won't, as opposed to the Canada can't person, the Canada that won't person says, well, if this is the best they're going to do, how much pressure can we put on them in order to get them to that level faster? I will say, if you got to 2% after we elected Donald Trump as president, I think a lot of people would roll their eyes and wonder if you were just saying that to get him off your back, kind of defensive promise going in. And if we don't elect Donald Trump, would you still be making the efforts to get to 2% in time? That's the dilemma. We're having a kind of guessing game about what Canada can and can't do. And Canada's promises sound good, but it's just the delivery that's always fallen short. And the concern is that you won't get there.
Chris, we have the Washington Summit just around the corner. I'm wondering if you'd like to offer any insight on what Canada might expect at the summit, particularly in light of some of the topics we've discussed.
If you look at where Canada is, it's a founding member of NATO. It has taken NATO commitments relatively seriously, although obviously not gotten to 2%. If NATO is the vehicle going forward, the challenge for Canada is to become a fully fledged member of the alliance by paying 2%. But if what comes out of the summit is that NATO is good for what NATO is good for, then when we start looking at other structures, the sort of Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific architecture is sort of taking shape around Quads. Canada doesn't have a seat at that table, and probably won't have one. I can't see that coming. Maybe for some joint exercises and things, but not much beyond that. So for Canada, the Washington Summit is going to be about, I think, reinforcing the value of NATO, and then maybe making the kind of commitment that would see Canada be not as isolated as it currently is. I wish that Canada's defense policy update, and more broadly its defense policy, was more forthrightly discussed in the Canadian conversation about politics. The U.S. has some anxiety about Trudeau meeting 2%. We've gone back and forth and tried to provide support and incentives. It's not clear that there's any political price to pay in Canada for falling short. At the same time, we've heard Pierre Poilievre talk about a lot of things that he would do were he to form the next government in Canada. We haven't really heard a path to 2% from him either, or any sort of firm commitment in that regard. The most important thing, and I think Canada's going to be looking to this in the US election, the most important thing in these kinds of dialogues is having a sense that a commitment is a commitment and it's stable over time so that you can really count on it. Canadians looking at the US election rightly will say, well, will the new Trump administration continue to question Article 5? Is that going to blow up NATO as we know it? And in particular, will Trump decide he's going to push the Ukrainians to sue for peace and lose half their territory because he doesn't want to be fighting that war? That's a very legitimate question for Canadians to ask. And what does that mean for your friends and allies around the world? But at the same time, I think the US question is, where will Canada go? And if it's possible to continually fall short of 2% and not have any particular, I mean, certainly Conference of Defense Associations, there are great organizations that will be upset, but will the average Canadian, especially the millennial Generation Z voter who's kind of grown their whole life with Canada as an underspender on defense, do they see the room for this? Do they care enough to want to re-up? Because one of the answers for NATO, even though it survived 75 years, is that it gets retooled or replaced with something that's a bit more fit for purpose in the modern era. And whether Canada's on board for that is a question we're asking here. So going into the NATO summit, but more importantly into 24, 25 and the elections that we'll both have, trying to get a sense of how committed we are to our mutual defense will be important for everybody. And whether this becomes part of the conversation in Canada or the US or both, I think will be a really important thing to watch for the future of the defense relationship 20 years from now.
Chris, thanks again. Always a pleasure. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Varner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next week.